Okay, hello everybody. There is a bit of a delay here, so I don't know how well this is working. So I'm gonna just ramble a little bit, and if you guys can see me and you can see the chat, you can see all that stuff. Feel free to just say hello on the chat, just to let me know everything's working. This is the first time I've done this kind of semi-professional live stream with all this crazy gear and all this software and everything. Still relatively new to the live streaming, so definitely hoping that this is actually working. So yeah, I see we have a couple of viewers. We got about 5 or so people watching right now. So if you guys can hear this, definitely send me a message on that chat there, and we'll kind of give some people some time to kind of come to this live stream. So for those of you who are here, oh, there is Rithik saying hi. So Rithik is super stoked to see how this turns out. Rithik, I also am super stoked to see how this turns out. Oh, Mo's there. Okay, awesome. So sounds like you guys can hear me okay, which is really good. So um, yeah, so again, I'm just going to give some people a bit more time to join this. If you guys are kind of curious as to how this is going to go and what the format's going to be like, we're basically going to. Again, this is kind of up in the air. It's a little bit of an MVP, minimum viable product. Hey to Zach, hey to Gabe. So this is kind of a little bit. I'm going to be testing this, and hopefully we can get this going a little bit more regularly. I don't know, maybe once a week we could do this, maybe once every 2 weeks or something. What I like about this format is that it's not too much effort for me. Like obviously I have to do some setup here, but once we get going, it's not really that much effort for me to like edit it or anything like that because I'm not editing it. I'm just kind of recording this live, which is really cool. So, um, so yeah, so anyway, so the format of this is really kind of up in the air right now. I have a plan for today. I do have a plan for today, but I'm again willing to see what the audience wants and where we're going to go with this. So, for everybody who is here, if you guys don't know what this is all about, obviously with everything that's happening in the world right now, classes were canceled for a bit and then they all went online. And I've seen a lot of people doing live streaming, things like this. And I thought it would be a really good time for me to do some live streaming myself. And I thought maybe something that would be beneficial is to kind of reach out to the software community, specifically, software engineering and computer science students. Now, you don't have to be a computer science student or a software engineering student to be on this. Basically, anybody who wants to learn software can join for sure. I'm happy to chat, but I do plan to get semi-technical. I do plan to talk about coding concepts, things like that. And so, if you're just casually in the software space, some of that stuff might be very boring to you. It might be interesting to you. But again, we'll see where things go. I'm also happy to talk about things that are not very code specific though, and not very computer sciencey. I run a software business called ByteSite. We do custom software, and if you guys have any questions about running a business or my experience, how I got there, anything really, I'm really happy to open that up. So again, thanks everybody for joining. I think we have let me just check here. Got a billion things on the go here to make this happen. It's surprisingly complex to make all this happen. Like there's I wish I had 5 monitors going right now. But anyways, I think we'll just get started. I don't want to hold everybody all night, so we'll just get started. So before I do get started, there are a couple notes here that I have that I'd like to mention. So first of all, I'd like to apologize to all the people on LinkedIn because I was not really sure what the best way to get the word out was, and so I added a lot of you, and then I'm sure you guys were getting endless notifications of people liking that message and all this stuff. So I apologize for all the notifications you guys might have been getting on LinkedIn, but I do really appreciate the support, and I really appreciate you guys spreading the word. We have kind of a small crowd here today, but hopefully we can build this up to be bigger and bigger. I've heard through the grapevine there are things at Ottawa U where there's a big Facebook Messenger group. Maybe we can kind of put it out on there. Things like that, but I really do hope to grow this to a little bit of a bigger crew. One thing I want to give a brief kind of advertisement to You'll see Rithik Shah has just messaged on the live chat here. I want to give a bit of a shout out to something that he's been working on with his team at CISA. So CISA is the Software Engineering Student Association at U Ottawa, and they've been doing these kind of interviews that they're kind of releasing releasing in the format of YouTube videos and a podcast. So if you haven't checked it out already, check out U Ottawa CISA. SESA, and look for it on all the popular podcasting platforms, but they're also on YouTube as well. If I remember, I'll put a link in the description of this video at the end. But Rithik's doing an amazing job where he is actually he's doing interviews with students who have worked at big companies. So he interviewed a friend of ours, Amara, who did an internship at Shopify and then went to Microsoft and now is going to Amazon. He's interviewed a couple professors as well, which is really cool. And I'm very impressed with what's going on there. So so Mo was just saying that there's a cool new interview with two of the profs at Ottawa U. So definitely check that out. Support them. I think they're doing an awesome job. I love seeing people, just run with an idea. I remember when Rithik started talking about it, and his mission was to spread the word to more people. And this is really great. So really, really appreciate that. So a big shout out to that. Check that out. Something else I want to talk about just very briefly before I forget. So the software that I'm using is a really powerful free software called Open Broadcast Software. And as great as it is, it does tend to crash. And I have seen it crash a couple times since I've used it. I've only been using this since the weekend, and I've seen it crash a couple times. So if it does crash, just hang tight. Don't worry. Like the feed will kind of the YouTube will just kind of spin around for a while. So just hang tight. All I have to do is restart the software and I'll be live again within kind of seconds, maybe minutes at most. So if the feed does cut off, just hang tight. I'll get back on. You can always message me as well. So. Okay, so again, pretty funny there. Classicus saying that LinkedIn was very quickly muted. Yes. Again, I do appreciate that, and I do apologize. I know it's not really the social media etiquette to do things like that, but I do appreciate it out there. So hey to Sebastian, welcome. Okay, so what I'd like to do today is I really want to split this up into two parts. I thought it would be beneficial if at the beginning of every one of these kind of Q&A sessions, I do a little brief lecture, just a little brief thing, some kind of software concept or some kind of best practice or startup concept or something like that, just to kind of give a little bit of a formal lecture. Now, I do say a little bit of formal because I haven't really prepped these that much, so I do forgive me if they're not super polished. But I thought that'd be a good way to kind of start the conversation, kind of get some kind of formal lesson across to you guys. And then, you'll learn a little something every time you come here. And then after that, we'll kind of do the rest of the session as a Q&A. So you guys can type your questions and I'll pick a couple and I'll answer them. Now, as this goes over time, you guys can help dictate that. You can help say, oh, Casey, I'd really like more formal lectures and less Q&A, or I'd like more Q&A, whatever you guys think. So, okay, so I'm going to jump right into it. So I'm going to go and just kind of bring up this presentation that I have here. So today's lecture is going to be all about, semantics, the importance of semantics. So as a software engineer, sometimes we hear this term tossed around a lot. We talk about semantics, and I feel like a lot of times, ironically, and you'll see in a second, we don't really understand the meaning of the word semantics. And, some people use it in the same sentence as syntax. They'll say, oh, there's syntax and there's semantics. And I don't really think that makes sense. I mean, it kind of makes sense. And you'll see as I kind of go through my examples that, yes, I will use the word syntax and semantics kind of in the same sentence, but they really do cover two separate concepts. And I think something that software engineers get very good at is getting very good at, they get very good at syntax. And the more they dive deeper and deeper into software engineering and coding, they start to lose more and more their ability to understand good semantics. And I see this a lot. I see this a lot actually. And people just forget about semantics. And so I thought it would be really good today to talk a little bit about the importance of semantics in software engineering, and specifically coding actually. And there's a lot of different places we can talk about semantics when it comes to software engineering. Okay, so for those who don't know what the word semantics means, or for those who have heard many different meanings about the word semantics, and I'm sure there are different interpretations of the word semantics, but what I'm talking about when I talk about semantics is I'm literally talking about meaning. Okay, so when people talk about the semantics of your code, or the semantics of your method, or the semantics of your variable, or the semantics of whatever, really, at least in this lecture, what I'm talking about is the meaning of that. Okay, so when you code a method, what is the meaning of that method? In other words, what is it supposed to do? All right, and what's the intention of it? What's the meaning of that method or that variable or whatever, right? And so when I talk about semantics, what we're talking about is, again, giving your code meaning. Okay. And when I talk about meaning, I kind of mean meaning outside of the coding context. In other words, if you talked about this method to somebody who didn't code, okay, how would you explain it to them? Okay, how would you explain it to them? All right. So today I'm going to talk about good semantics. Okay, it's one thing to say semantics. Semantics is meaning, but what we want to talk about today is what good semantics are. And what I consider good semantics for somebody who codes is, I consider good semantics is that your code does what it says it does. Okay, and the says part, that is the kind of out of the code meaning. Okay, so if we were to use natural language, like whatever your first language is, if it's French, English, Spanish, Chinese, whatever it is, okay, if you were to talk about your code in natural language, okay, you would say it does something. And then if your code matches up to what it says it does, then in my opinion, you've adhered to good semantics. Okay, so that's what this is all about, is good semantics. Okay, and so let me give you a really good example here, or not a really good example, but a really basic example of good semantics versus bad semantics. Okay. Okay, so I chose Java. Now you guys will have to forgive me. I haven't done Java in a long time, but I know a lot of you guys do Java. So I know a lot of you guys do Java. So I just chose Java as a language that hopefully most of us understand. But you'll have to forgive me if there's some syntax errors here, but you'll get the point here. Okay, so we have public class math utils, and what we have is we have a method here. Okay, so we have a static method, so we can call this directly on the class. So we can do math utils dot, and in this case we call it add, and add returns an integer. Okay, and it takes in two variables. Okay, two parameters. It takes in an integer a and an integer b. And pretty simply, it returns a plus b. Okay, so what I like about this is good semantics. Okay, what we got here is we have a method called add, and in the natural language, if you're talking to somebody who doesn't code, we understand what adding two numbers means. That if we put in a 2 and a 2, it should come out to 4, right? And so that's the meaning, and the code, or sorry, that's what you're saying it does with the add. And then what your code does is add those two numbers. So here your code matches what you're saying that it does. Okay, so that's good semantics. Here's an example of bad semantics. All right, so you have public class math utils, and you create a static method called add that returns an integer, and it takes in two integers. And the implementation of that method is return a minus b. Okay, now syntactically, there's nothing wrong with this. Okay, you followed Java's syntax of how to define a method, how to use the return statement, how to use semicolon, how to use curly braces. It will compile, how to define parameters. You've done all that syntactically correct. And this will still work, obviously. But now the method name has lost its meaning. Okay, because you're calling it add. You're saying that this thing should add two numbers. And what you're doing on the inside is you're subtracting one number from another. Right? So at this point, it's lost its meaning. Right? So in this case, you have bad semantics. All right? Now, that's a pretty contrived example. And you guys might be like, well, I'd never do that, right? And that's true. Like, it would be a little bit ridiculous if you did that. But I want to get into more concrete examples that I think that show where this actually creeps up. And it's very prevalent. I see it a lot of times, and I do it a lot of times. I do this a lot of times. And usually the reason it happens is because it leads to more work, unfortunately. Okay, so we'll get into this. So we can talk about good semantics in a lot of places, and today I'm going to talk about preserving good semantics while coding. Okay, preserving is the key word here. Well, there's a lot of keywords in here. Good semantics, preserving, whatever. There's a lot in there. So preserving good semantics. Sorry, I'm checking my chat every now and then just to make sure I'm not missing anything. So preserving good semantics. So what preserving means is we're going to change code and we want to retain good semantics. Okay, so after we change the code, we want to make sure that the semantics are still good. Now, one thing I really don't want people to get confused in this sentence. I'm not talking about preserving code. You can change code. What I'm talking about is preserving the concept of good semantics. Okay, so let's take a look at an example here. Okay, so let's say we have a Java class, a public class called person, and we have an instance variable called name that has the name Casey in there. And then we have a very simple method called getName. Okay, so and it returns the name. So kind of simple accessor, right? We may have a set name as well if we want, right? Okay, so simple enough. This is what you have. And let's say this is what you're presented with at work or a project or something like that. And then this is somebody else's code, and they've given you the assignment that, hey, it turns out that, we'd like to really separate the idea of first name and last name. Let's give a last name. Okay, so we only have first name stored here. So let's give a last name to this. Okay, so you're like, okay, that's sweet. That's easy enough. Okay, and you might think to yourself, okay, well, you know what, get name might be used a lot of places. So this is going to be my first attempt at the code. Okay, so I'm going to add another instance variable called last name. Okay, initialize it to Lee. And when somebody calls get name, it's going to simply append, like concatenate the name with last name. And then there we go. We got the full name, right? Probably should be a space in there. Maybe concatenate another space in there. Otherwise, they'll just run together. But that looks pretty good. Okay. Syntactically works. The nice thing about this is that anybody who called get name in the past will now be able to just continue to use it because the API of person hasn't changed, right? So everybody who calls get name, every other object in your application calls get name doesn't have to change, which is great. So this all looks really good. Okay. And normally that might be a good reason to stop there. You might be like, there may be 50 places where they call get name. I'm not going to go and change those 50 places. That would be ridiculous. But I would argue against that because now I would say that this is starting to lose good semantics. This is starting to lose meaning. Like this still works, but now we have a lot of confusion, okay? We've introduced a lot of confusion in here because let's say a brand new coder comes in here and they're like, oh yeah, name. Okay, that makes sense. So name must be, wait, is name first name or is name last name? Oh, right, okay. Oh, I gotta look into the class and do that. Oh, okay. Now I'm gonna code another class and use that and type get name. Oh, wait, now, I forgot what get name does. So now I gotta go look into the person class and figure that out. And that's a really bad level of abstraction. If somebody has to go into your class to figure out what your class does, then you're not programming a good API. You're not programming good abstraction there. They have to look into your code to figure out what it does. And so there's all this confusion that happens with new programmers, and we start to not figure out. Now, like in the past, like the last attempt that we did, right? The way the code was originally, this is okay because there was only one name being stored in the entire system, so that's okay. But now that we've introduced a second name, we're losing those good semantics. So even though it might be a lot of effort to go through the rest of your code and fix this, I would highly suggest you do this. So now be very explicit that we have a first name and a last name, and that we change that method name to get full name. And maybe you add other accessors too. Maybe you have get first name and get last name, but now you've removed that ambiguity. And now your semantics, you have good semantics. Now people who use the method get full name, they'll know that they'll have a really good idea of what is coming back. Okay, so that's a good way to preserve good semantics. Okay, so one of the lessons here basically is that when you change code, ask yourself, does your method, does your variable, does your class still have good semantics? Okay. All right, let's do another example here. I'll do an HTML example. And there is a typo in these slides. So if at the very bottom, I forgot to close off a body tag. Here I fixed it, but there's a future slide that I didn't, so ignore that. Okay. So for those of you who know HTML, you might come across something like this. You have HTML tag, and then there'll be a head tag at the top, and then a body tag in the middle. And inside the body tag, you have a div that is going to be a list of courses. And inside that div courses, you have a div called course. And inside that course, you have a header that shows the name, and then inside there, you have the email. So let's say you want to sign up for that class, you could email sign up SEG2900@example.com. And there may be a couple of these courses like listed in here. Now, what I like about this is this has really good semantics. I really like HTML programmers that add classes even if they're not using them for CSS or JavaScript, because it gives meaning to a div. Like div is not very descriptive. Div could be anything. Div is short for division, I believe. So people who put in things like courses and course, even though they're not marrying that to CSS or JavaScript, I really like that because it gives meaning to it. So it's good semantics. So I really like this. Okay. And then we have the email itself, and then that's sitting inside an email container. So maybe the email container, there's some div there to make some styling changes or whatever. Okay, so let's say you're given this as a web developer, and your boss tells you, hey, I would really love you to just add the phone number to the courses. Okay, like people want to phone in, not only email. I was like, okay, that's fine. I'd like it to show up right beside the email too. That'd be great. Okay, so that's simple enough, right? We just change it and we add the class phone, which is great. Okay, so that's good, and that has good semantics itself. The div class phone, right? Because that's the phone number, so that's really great. But something has now lost good semantics. Okay, look at the container that contains both those divs. It's called email container, right? And so, but what's inside there? The email and the phone number, right? So that class no longer makes sense. And I'll tell you again, the tendency might be to say, oh, you know what? I don't want to change that because there might be some CSS or JavaScript referencing that. Okay, well, again, I would argue that this thing makes things more confusing, because then if somebody in the future changes that CSS or JavaScript, they might be thinking they're only affecting the email, because the thing's called email container, right? So you might want to change that. So to preserve good semantics in this case, I would change it to something like contact details. I mean, you could change it. I mean, sometimes if you can't think of a good name, you might call it email and phone container. You could do that. You'll see that in my code a lot of times. I'm terrible at naming stuff. But this now preserves good semantics. Okay. So I see this a lot, whether it be in my classes, whether it be at work, whether it be at open source code, whether it be new programmers, whatever it is, I see this time and time again where people don't look at the semantics that they're affecting. Okay. And the more you program good or preserve good semantics, you will make everybody's lives a lot easier. Okay. The people who use your code, the people who use your methods, who do your code reviews, they'll understand things a lot. And when you go to modify the code, it's like a lot easier, because you start to get into your head what is being affected when you change that code. Okay. So preserving good semantics, really remember that, guys. It's a really important thing. And this idea of good semantics goes to everything, by the way. We talk about class names, method names, variable names, interface names, table names, even software concepts and what you use when. Okay. One of the biggest revelations I had was about Java interfaces versus abstract classes. I talk about interfaces and just think, an interface is a class that has no methods defined, and it starts with the word interface. Like, that's the technical implementation meaning. But when you think about what an interface is in real life, it's something that you interact with, right? So when you have a calculator, the interface are the buttons that you can press, right? No one knows what those buttons do in the back, but when you press the button, something happens, right? And so that's the interface, right? So when you talk about learning Java interfaces, think about it that way. What's the English meaning of the word? It's something that's between two things that are interacting with each other, right? In Java, it happens to be one class interacting with another class. There's an interface in between them that defines how they can interact with each other, right? So things like that, like we don't like these words like interface, abstract classes, inheritance, private, public, all these things. We don't pick these names randomly. We pick them because they have some kind of semantic meaning in the real world and natural language, right? Now, I know this is harder for a lot of people who English is not their first language. Unfortunately, coding to this day is still pretty much written in English, right? But it is very important when you're coding to understand the meaning of what you're doing in terms of public, private, variable names, method names, and all these things, okay? And the big take-home message here is that although it may be annoying and lead to a lot more work and even potentially buggy code in the near term, preserving good semantics is really important for the long term. Okay? So that is my lesson on semantics. Hopefully you guys understand that. Really, really drill that into your head. It's something that I myself have started to learn. And I mean, I've been a software engineer for almost 20 years now, and only in the last 5 years or so have I kind of started to be really passionate about this idea of preserving good semantics. Okay, so before we get to the Q&A, was there any questions about semantics and what I just kind of talked about there? How do you okay, so Classicus is asking, how do you balance semantics and deprecations without it getting too spaghetti-like? Okay, so yes, there is definitely that concern that... So managing, semantics and deprecation. So yeah, the idea here is, if I understand you, Classicus, is that you have this issue again where if you change code, like changing get name to get full name, now all of a sudden, you have to change code everywhere, right? And yes, that's true. And on bigger projects, that's an issue. And deprecations, usually the way you solve that is you will have get name and you'll have get full name, and get name just refers to get full name, and you kind of tell people, hey guys, we're going to be retiring this soon, right? And yes, that's very true. That's definitely an issue. But I think if I look at how deprecations work and how a lot of the bigger projects operate, they're doing a lot of these things for that reason. Like they give you kind of a grace period where they'll say, okay, if it's a really big project and a lot of people depend on this get name, then what I'll do is I will create this method and I'll leave it for a year. And then next year when we release a new release, we're gonna get rid of that, right? And kind of give that warning. So maybe in your get name, you output a warning saying deprecation warning or whatever. This method is going to be retired. So I don't have a ton of experience with deprecations. I will be 100% transparent. My projects are generally a lot smaller. I'm not working on the big projects like Ruby on Rails core, these kind of things. So in my experience, it's definitely a little bit of a headache to change everything. But again, in the long run, it ends up being a lot more beneficial. So, okay, Tasty Pastry. I find that whenever I undertake a project, the code gets increasingly verbose and unreadable. Any tips to prevent this, such as when to create new methods or how to create reusable code? Okay, so yeah, it's a good question. So again, the question is like when you have a project that goes on a really long time, there's a lot of methods and a lot of code and a lot of sometimes a duplication of the same method that's basically doing the same thing. And I would argue that sometimes that's a result of bad semantics. Sometimes a method is named so well that it does everything you want it to do, and you can just use that method rather than having like 10 other methods, right? But it's going to still happen. It's going to still happen that it's going to get very big and verbose and unreadable. It's going to get really crazy. There are a couple of small software principles that can help with that. So kind of keeping methods small. Some people talk about the single responsibility method, where your method only does one thing and then other methods are kind of comprised of those methods to make bigger methods. That really helps sometimes. But again, most of these tactics, I shouldn't call them tactics, they're principles. Most of these principles, they only go so far. Your code is still going to get really big and sometimes unreadable and sometimes not very maintainable. What we do at Byteside, and I'm not saying this is the right way to do it, but in my experience, what this is a little bit of a kind of, it's kind of a workflow and philosophy problem. In other words, when you're working with a team, you want to encourage refactoring a lot. Okay, so for those who don't know what refactoring is basically changing your code but effectively getting the same output. Okay, so usually the way I say it is like refactoring, the user would never notice you refactored something. Okay, or if you're refactoring a class that somebody else is using, nobody would ever notice who's using that class that you've changed something. Okay, it's kind of like changing the internals or changing some of the code, but it kind of behaves the same way. But you're changing the code because you're making code drier, like don't repeat yourself, or you're renaming things or whatever to make it more maintainable. So what we do at ByteSight is we try not to we generally have an encouragement to say, okay, when you're assigned a task, try to stick to the task that you're doing, because if we're reviewing your code and you're touching something else, that can be very dangerous. If somebody's testing your code and doesn't realize to test something that doesn't really have to do with the feature that we're building, that can be very dangerous. So we kind of say stick to what you're doing, but in the confines of what you're doing. So if you were asked to modify the checkout page, or you're asked to modify the product page or something, we generally try to encourage, if you see something that can be refactored, like getting rid of an old method or renaming something to have good semantics or drying up your code or whatever, then we encourage that. Okay, and that's how we introduce kind of improvements to the code, right? So that's one way of doing it. That's not the only way, and I'm sure the big guys have way better ways of doing this. But I do think what you're talking about, Tasty Pastry, is that's going to happen inevitably. Like, I think it's going to happen with every team. I think it's going to happen with everything. And I think it should happen, because if you develop software in a nice MVP way, in other words, you kind of like build the minimum viable version first, and then you kind of build on it and you build on it and you build on it and you build on it, like incrementally, as good software is usually developed, then inevitably what's going to happen is that code's going to get messy because you didn't anticipate all these changes happening, and then 1 year later you have this mess of code. So usually what we do at ByteSight is, like, after a year of that, we'll say, okay, maybe it's time now that we've learned everything that we need to learn from the users and the feedback and everything, we kind of like now revamp that and refactor it, knowing now what we know. Okay, you don't want to make the opposite mistake of doing that too soon, because you don't know that stuff's going to happen unless you get it up to a user and get an audience on that. So I definitely agree with you. It's going to happen a lot, but I would encourage that you have a philosophy among your team that encourages refactoring on a relatively regular basis. So, Professor Turcotte explained, interface can be seen as a relationship, whereas inheritance through a class is. That's a good point. What Professor Turcotte is explaining. See, he's using English explanations, right? And that's a great way to look at it, right? You really want to look at the semantics behind that. Okay, great. Okay, so why don't we jump to the Q&A? So I'm just going to jump to so here's the thing about the Q&A. I really do not want to profess to know everything about everything. And in fact, I was a very late bloomer when it came to software engineering, and I'm still way behind. I know I intended this for students, and a lot of times when I talk to students, they know way more than I do. So I don't really want to profess to know everything about everything. And a lot of what I say sometimes just is completely wrong. So there's that possibility. I'm going to draw as much as I can from my experience. So if you're curious about the stuff that I know and that I use, I'm going to put up a list in a second. Doesn't mean you can't ask stuff outside of that. I can try my best to answer stuff outside of that, but it's just so you guys have a little bit of context of where my experience comes from and what I'm used to dealing with. So one of the big things that you guys should understand is I went kind of from one of the biggest employers to one of the smallest employers. I started at the government and I worked as a software engineer there. Then I went to a private company of about 1,000 people, that was developing software in the neighborhood of, I can't remember how many customers they had, but definitely lots of customers. Then I went to a really tiny company of about 13 people, and then I started my own business. So when you're talking about asking me about like what it'd be like to work at Amazon or what it'd be like to work at Shopify or Google or Facebook, I really unfortunately do not have a lot of that experience. And I will say a lot of what I say might contradict working for companies like those. When you're working in kind of small startups or small to medium business, the kinds of things that you focus on and the kinds of challenges you solve can be very different than what you solve at big companies. Like, for example, I would say at a startup, you generally are more powerful if you are a generalist and you know a lot of different languages and a lot of different technologies and are jack of all trades. And I would say at a small or medium business, if you are very specialized, let's say like you're like the best stored procedure database writer, you're probably not going to do that great in a small to medium business. Whereas at big companies, that's exactly what they're looking for. They're looking for those kinds of people. So just preface that my experience in big companies is basically nothing. I haven't really worked with those companies a lot. I've talked to a couple of people who worked in those companies, but haven't worked in a lot of them myself. Okay, technologies that I know. Let's see here. Okay, so on the left is basically my day-to-day. This is what I deal with on a day-to-day basis when I do coding. So my main language for a long time has been Ruby on Rails. I've been doing Ruby on Rails since about 2011. In the last probably 3 to 4 years, I've been doing React, so React JavaScript. And inherent in those, you learn HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So quite well versed in those. Not super well versed in the newer flavors of JavaScript. My ES 2015 knowledge is quite good. Above that, it starts to flutter a little bit. Not Flutter like the Google framework, but Flutter. Only a software engineer video chat would get that joke. The database that I use mainly is PostgreSQL, but that's really any SQL. So MySQL, SQL Server Database, these kind of things. Oracle is another one. Recently, I've been doing mobile development in the last 6 months to a year or so. I've been dabbling a lot with React Native and Expo. Deployment tools I use Heroku, I use Git, I use GitHub, I use Bitbucket. And I deal a lot with the Adobe Creative Suite for design work. I deal a little bit with Sketch. I like Sketch. It's not bad. I'm a little bit more comfortable in the Adobe Creative Suite. And then on the right side is stuff that I have kind of dabbled in at one point or another. But my knowledge is pretty weak at this point. But Java, JSP, ASP.NET, C#.NET, Objective-C, Swift, Node.js. There's a bunch of other things that I deal with, like I use Trello every day, Slack, obviously all these things. But I thought I'd just start with that to kind of get the ball rolling a little bit. So, okay, so that's pretty much it. Why don't now I open up the floor a little bit to some questions. Okay, so Tasty Pastries loving the Heroku. Heroku is pretty awesome. For those who don't know what Heroku is, they advertise it as a deployment as a service. So for those who are kind of building web applications, whether that be in Java, .NET, Ruby on Rails, Node, whatever, one of the things that you want to do probably eventually is get it out to the world, right? And it's actually one of the most powerful things about web development is that getting it out to the world is a lot easier than telling people to install an app on your desktop. Well, at least it used to be. Now with things like App Store and Google Play, it's a lot easier. But so getting it out there in the world is something that can be hard to do. If you guys don't know how the web works, here's a really basic explanation of what you would need to do if you want to get a web server up and running. You would buy a computer, hook it up to the internet, run a program on that computer called a web server, and you would write down your IP address of that computer. Every computer has a global IP address. You write down the address of the computer, and then you send it to your friends. And then your friends would be able to go to that website that's running off your computer. Well, that's not great because if that computer dies or heaven forbid, something happens to your house or whatever, it's not very good. So what companies started doing is offering virtual servers out in the internet. So these are like computers running out in the internet that you can put your web code on and your web servers on and all that stuff like that. Now, to do that, that's a little bit tricky. Like to set up a machine that has all the dependencies that you need, has all the runtimes that you need. Like, let's say you're running a Java thing, you'd have to install the right version of Java. You'd have to do all this stuff, set it up, get the ports right, get everything set up and crazy. And it's like, sometimes you need a whole IT team just to manage that. The nice thing with Heroku is you can basically just push your code to the server And Heroku just does everything for you. It detects what language you're running, fires up the server, gives you a URL, all easy peasy done. The worst part about Heroku is how expensive it gets as soon as you get semi-successful. As soon as your app gets semi-successful, the costs start to go up quite a bit, actually. They start at like $7 a month, which is not too bad. But then as soon as your app starts to become pretty performant, you start to get to $50, $100, $150 a month, $200 a month, or whatever. So Heroku, deployment as a service. If you're just using it as a hobby, you can run a bunch of free hours on it. To JSP, could you talk for that about a bit? Okay, so JSP, for those who don't know, is the kind of one of the Java frameworks to build web applications. So it is a way to build a web application using Java as your backend language. So when we talk about web is always split up into two languages, front-end languages and back-end languages. Front-end languages are all the languages that run in your browser. So the way that a web page works is you type in www.cbc.ca. That goes to the server and fetches a page and loads it into your browser. The thing that it loads into your browser is code. And all that code is written in what we call client-side languages. So things like CSS, HTML, JavaScript, these kind of things. When you... this is actually a pretty big topic, and maybe I'll cover this more formally in another session. But there was this big revolution that when the web started, we were hand coding every bit of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. There was this kind of revolution in web where we realized that hand coding that stuff didn't make a lot of sense, and we could use other languages to code that for us. And those other languages are what we call backend languages. So when you type in www.cbc.ca, chances are what's happening is your browser is making a request to the server. And then when it gets to that server executes some backend or server-side code that generates HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that gets spit back to the browser. So those backend languages, there's a lot of them. You can use Ruby, you can use C#, you can use Java, you can use Node, you can use all these different types of server-side languages. And all of them have some kind of web framework built around them. So Java has something called JSP, and among other things, I think there's a bunch of others there. C# and Visual Basic have .NET. Ruby has Ruby on Rails and Sinatra, and there's a couple other web frameworks that have Ruby. Node has Express, I believe, is a web framework that Node uses. So Java Server Pages, JSP, this is basically one of the early implementations of a web framework using Java. And in fact, that was not my first foray into web development, but really the first one that I really started to understand. I remember being at work and I got really frustrated because I think my coworker was really kind of making me angry and making me feel inadequate. This was back in the days when I really felt inadequate in software engineering. And he was making me feel not so great about my knowledge. And so I got really angry. And when I get angry, a lot of times what I do is I live well, right? The best revenge is living well. And what I did is I grabbed a JSP book, just sat at my desk and read for I don't know, 2 days or so. And then I started to really understand web development at that point. So that's what JSP is all about. Tasty Pastry, what were the main obstacles when starting your company and how did you overcome them? Cool. Okay. The main obstacles when starting my company and how did I overcome them? So it's interesting because just starting the company, there wasn't a ton of obstacles, to be honest. And for anybody out there who's thinking of starting a company, just starting is really not an obstacle unless you're not very self-motivated. I mean, self-motivation obviously is a big factor, but if you're self-motivated and you're really hell-bent on starting a company, just starting it is usually not that hard. There's not a lot of obstacles there. What gets hard is keeping it alive and growing it. And it's still a challenge I face today. I don't know if you guys know, but in January, I shut down half of my company. I ended up shutting down the video production side of ByteSite, and I had to let go of some employees. And it's just we've been around for 7 years, and we're still struggling to grow and to stay alive. It's a very tough thing. But starting, there's not a lot of obstacles. I definitely had some visions in mind. So I wanted a website, so I built a website. I kind of had a vague idea about what I wanted to offer, and that was it. I did do some of the legal stuff, like you can register for a business name and these kind of things. So I did that. So you can look a lot of this stuff up, like registering a business in Ontario or Canada or wherever you guys are or whatever. And I did that. And then really I just sent out an email. Again, a lot of you guys have heard this story. But I basically sent out an email to everybody I knew, and that's how I started the company. So just starting the company, at least, sorry, I should preface this with the fact of what ByteSite does. ByteSite is a service company, and so it's a lot easier to define what you're doing, right? A product company is a lot harder, right? So service company, I basically say, hey, do you want to pay me to build you a website? Do you want to pay me to build you a web app? It's very easy to sell that. I shouldn't say easy, but easier to sell than, hey, I'm building an app that connects people around the world and da-da-da-da-da, right? That gets a little bit tricky, right? So starting the company, there weren't that many obstacles besides self-motivation. I would say, and I've said this before in other talks, but if you're thinking about starting a company, don't get too worried about all the things that you have to do right. I got a little bit worried about, legal registration of the corporation and payroll and all this stuff like that. And it turns out a lot of times you don't really need that to just start the company. You like, if you're just starting the company, like if you're just building a product or whatever, just get coding, start talking to people, start trying to get users, these kind of things, right? Work on that, and you'll figure out everything else as you go. And that's how I've run ByteSite. 7 years ago, I didn't know nearly probably 90% of what I know now as a business owner. But all that stuff came very gradual. Like when I hired my first person, only then did I learn about payroll. These kind of things. There's a lot to learn. Actually, when my first employee left the company, figuring out how to do a record of employment, all this stuff, how to draft up a contract, how to set my pricing, all this stuff, right? You'll figure it kind of as you go. So starting a company, I think the biggest thing I would advise you guys is just don't be afraid about getting everything right. Just get going. Start with what you know. If you know how to code, start coding your product. If you know how to do some marketing, start doing marketing. If you know how to talk to people, start talking to people. That's what I would recommend. Okay, let's see here. Got a couple more here. Would you recommend creating projects with Expo or plain old? Oh, good question from Mark. Good friend Mark. Mark asked, would you recommend starting projects in Expo or React Native? Plain old React Native. So for those who don't know what Expo and React Native are, so React was a JavaScript framework that had a lot of principles that allowed you to create really rich HTML and JavaScript interfaces. So really create really awesome web experiences, basically. So React is I can't stop saying good stuff about React. What the Facebook team did is they brought that exact same kind of library and philosophy to mobile development and created React Native. And the only real difference between React and React Native is in React, you use stuff like HTML tags. So like a list tag, an anchor tag, an H1 tag, all these things. In React Native, you still use the same kind of framework and you use the same philosophies, but now you're using mobile components. So things like text view, list view, buttons, these kind of things. So that's what React Native is. And what it allows you to do is code in JavaScript and web-like syntax and output to iOS and Android. And actually what's kind of weird is now you can also output to web. It's weird. It's kind of went full circle. So you can output to web, but it started off as just iOS and Android. And then what this group, so this is Facebook who made React, and then Facebook made React Native. React Native is awesome. It's been like my saving grace for mobile development. And then there's this group of people who built one layer on top of React Native called Expo. So Expo is like, if you are a React Native developer, there were a lot of things that you would do in React Native that would be kind of common to a lot of apps. And there'd be a lot of things you'd have to set up and all this stuff like that. And there'd be a lot of libraries that you would use kind of frequently. So this team built one layer above React Native called Expo to make React Native even more simple. And they include a lot more libraries. They help you out a lot. They give you this like build server, which is amazing. A lot of really awesome things there. So the question is, so Expo is one layer above React Native. So the question is, should you just start in React Native or should you start in Expo, right? Really simple answer. I really have a firm answer on this. I don't usually have firm answers on a lot of things. 100% start in Expo. 100% start in Expo. The reason being is Expo has the ability to eject. There's this process in Expo called ejecting. And when you eject, basically what it allows you to do is it basically outputs the code to a regular React Native project. And then you can kind of continue in React Native and do all the things that you can't do in Expo. Because Expo is a little bit limited in some of the things you do. So if you look up Expo eject or something like that, that's what you would do. So in my opinion, like there's no question, just start on Expo, because Expo makes things really simple. I've built apps in Expo in like a couple hours that were ready for people to see. So I believe it's this ejecting to Expo kit. Yeah, I believe this is what it is. So yeah, cool. All right, what else we got here? In order to develop a mobile application, which platform would you recommend? Is Android Studio a good option? Okay, so this kind of goes back to if you want to develop a mobile application, what would you want to start with? Is Android Studio a good platform to use? So I've very rarely used Android Studio. I mean, it's kind of the default thing to use to build Android apps. So I would say if you're brand new to mobile development, you've never done mobile development ever in your life, I would say you start with whatever's the least barrier to entry. So if you know Java already, like you know how to code Java, I would recommend using Android Studio and coding an Android app, because I believe to this day you can still code Android apps in Java. I think they have a new language called Kotlin, but like you can still program things in Java. And so on top of figuring out everything else you need to figure out to code an Android application, if you had to figure out a new language, that would be really tough. So if you know Java already, I'd say just go for it. Android Studio, start building an Android app and start learning it that way. If you're coming from the web world, if you know how to program web applications, I would very much recommend there's something called Cordova. And Cordova, I believe, just uses HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And what Cordova does is it kind of fakes a mobile application. And what it actually does is it launches a web browser, like an invisible web browser inside your app. And you're kind of basically interacting with HTML and CSS. If you happen to know React, I would say look at React Native or Expo. If you don't know any of these languages and all of them are equivalent, I would just pick one and start going and see how it goes. And if you get frustrated and you stop, go try a different one. And that's what I did. I started coding with Objective-C, had a really not great time, so I stopped. Then I tried Swift, got a little bit further, then I stopped. Did React Native, got a little bit further, then stopped. Went to Expo, and finally kind of I'm getting on there. So yeah, so I think Android Studio is fine if you know Java and if you're doing Android. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Which brings me kind of to a point, guys, by the way, about something that I don't think any of you guys should worry about. A lot of people, I think, in software engineering, and this is why I felt inadequate as a software engineer for a lot of my software engineering career, is doing, again, the right thing, right? Like, oh, am I using the latest tool or the right thing or the whatever? And I don't think you should worry about that, and don't worry about the latest trends and the latest languages and all this stuff like that. Yeah, you'll hear React and Angular and you'll hear all these, you'll have React Native, you'll hear all the stuff that I'm talking about right now, and you'll get worried because you'll be like, oh, I don't know any of that stuff. That's okay. That's okay. Like, if you're just learning stuff, pick one thing and do a deep dive on it. I have a really good friend of mine, Dave Chapman. I'll do a little plug for my podcast. So I was interviewing him on my podcast, and he's one of the best software engineers I've ever met. And a lot of times I do say he's the best software engineer I've ever met. And his philosophy is like, all these new flavors of the month come out. React, Ember, whatever, Angular, and his philosophy on that is like, you know what? If he keeps switching languages and he keeps learning different things, he's not going to learn as much as if he does a deep dive on one thing and becomes really good at that, right? Because if he goes really good at that, then he'll be aware of concepts that are probably just translatable to other languages and other frameworks, right? So if you're worried about, again, like, oh, I picked Android Studio, but everybody else is using some other IDE or whatever, don't worry. If you're making progress in your learning, that's where you want to be. So, okay, we're getting more and more questions here. Tell us your journey about becoming a founder of ByteSite. Okay. Okay, I'll give the short version here. Again, maybe we'll dedicate a future stream to kind of the longer story. My journey to ByteSite. Okay, graduated software engineering, University of Ottawa, 2001 to 2005. I was not loving software engineering. I felt inadequate. I felt like I wasn't that great at it. I felt like I didn't enjoy it that much. I made this joke when Rithik was doing my AMA that I would hate those projects where you'd work 50 hours and your output was just like one line of a command line interface output. So like I just wasn't, software engineering wasn't a huge thing for me. I actually originally got into software engineering because I thought I wanted to be a video game programmer. And kind of halfway through it didn't really work out, and I was more into film production. So graduated in 2006, went to Vancouver for film school. Film school was great. I finished my 12 months there. I really loved it, learned a lot, but I didn't think a career was realistic in there, especially the lifestyle that it would lead. So I came back to Ottawa, worked for a company called Harris Computer Systems. Was doing really great there, was really enjoying my job there. But towards the end, I felt myself getting a little bit not super enthused about what I was doing there. So my friend had just gotten a job at Google, and I remember him asking me like, or him telling me and me thinking like, oh, maybe I can do something crazy or whatever. So I left my job at Harris and went to a company called Teldio for a couple of years. And it was between Harris and Teldio actually that I first started to really get passionate about software, because I learned Ruby on Rails actually. The reason I learned Ruby on Rails was because I wanted to get a job at Shopify. Didn't get the job at Shopify, but ended up getting hired by Teldio because of Ruby on Rails. After my job at Teldio, I still was kind of looking for something else. I actually applied to Shopify again and didn't get in. And then I basically decided to start my own company at that point. It was probably a buildup of a lot of different things. I think there was a little bit of personal satisfaction that I was lacking in terms of recognition. I felt like I was doing a good job at a lot of these companies, but I wasn't really being promoted. I wasn't really given, like people, don't get me wrong. All these companies treated me very, very well. And all the people at these companies treated me very, very well. And so it was really great, but I still felt like I could do something bigger or better. And so I basically decided to start my own company. And that's how it started. And the way it worked, now for the rest of the story, you can watch a video online on YouTube. But basically, I actually weaned off of my full-time job. I had a really great arrangement with the CEO. Again, they treated me so well. Where I basically weaned off a day at a time until I was basically down to one day every 2 weeks, and then eventually just went on my own. So again, there's a longer version of that. Even that was kind of a little bit long. So lots there to talk about. So all right, we got Gabe here. Gabe's a good friend of mine. Most of these people on here are good friends of mine. I find that the more that time goes on, the more people can make apps more easily, and I find like the market starts to get saturated. Do you think we should try to profile ourselves towards something more like AI, IoT, or blockchain, or stay more relevant, more competitive? Wow, that's a great question. Oh yeah, that's a really good question. So this is from Gabe. He's basically saying that nowadays more and more, what's happening is more and more people can develop apps more and more easily. And there's like no signs of it slowing down, and your value as a software engineer starts to decrease a little bit, right? Same thing happened on the web world, right? The web world, when you were a software engineer and you kind of knew HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, it was great. People were hiring you and it was great. And then all of a sudden, WordPress comes out, Squarespace comes out, Wix comes out, and it's like you can build a website completely by yourself, right? And you start to have to think like what your value is, right? And the interesting thing is there's two things that can happen here, right? Or maybe three things, maybe more. One is as much as these kind of do-it-yourself or things that become easier to do tools come out, the reality is it doesn't really convert people that much. It does convert some, but not completely. So, for example, when WordPress came out, it built itself. I think I don't really remember it coming out, but I assume that when it came out, it kind of built itself as a do-it-yourself, build your own website kind of service, right? And yes, while some people started doing it, the reality is the majority of people who were hiring people to build them websites were not all of a sudden not paying those people and create the website themselves, because they're still busy doing what they're doing, and they don't necessarily have some of the other expertise that comes along with it, right? Some of the design skills or the UX skills or whatever, right? And so what happened is there was a shift, right? Like people who were building websites no longer built them from scratch. They just used tools like Page Cloud and WordPress and all these things to build websites, but they're still being paid to do it. So that's one of the things you can do. You can look at these tools as really a way to expedite your work, right? So what used to take you 12 hours to build now only takes you 1 hour to build. Well, that's great. So you can almost be competitive on speed, right? And there is another aspect to this, which is, it's like the way I look at Ruby on Rails. So Ruby on Rails allows me to build apps very fast, very, very fast. So what normally would take me maybe 4 hours now only takes me 1 hour. And rather than just being done at 1 hour, I now have 3 hours extra to spare to make that even better. So if you know these frameworks and you know how they're built, the new player that comes in that can build apps, you're still going to be ahead of them. And what you should do is use this speed advantage to then add more impressive things to your app. So that's one route. Is just use the tools in your thing. The second route is to kind of be one level, kind of more, I want to say like less abstract, so more concrete. So if you think about it, we have WordPress, right? So we have HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and I think PHP it was built in. So you have that development. And then above that you have WordPress. And then above that you have the website builders. So a lot of WordPress, right? You have these WordPress shops who can build websites for people, but they wouldn't know how to build WordPress from scratch. They wouldn't know how to build the WordPress engine, but you could, right? So you're staying one level more concrete than that. And that's what ByteSite kind of did, right? ByteSite said, we're not going to build websites for you guys. We're going to build full-blown web apps for you guys, right? So as these tools become more, available. So let's say, for example, Expo or React Native or Flutter, right? You might want to start to educate yourself on the layer below that. How is Flutter built, right? What does that layer look like? And can I make something that's better than Flutter, or can I contribute to projects like Flutter or whatever? And target yourself in that market, right? And then the third thing is totally what you're suggesting. Should you target something like AI, IoT? Yeah, I think that if that interests you and you can make progress in that, I think that's a good option as well. I mean, it's like mobile was, 5 years ago or 15 years ago now, when mobile was just kind of budding, right? It was the new technology. So if you want to kind of get into IoT and stuff like that, I think that's a great thing. But if that stuff doesn't interest you, I think sharpening your knowledge in what you're existing, I think is still okay. I still like think about it. I learned HTML back in the 90s and I'm still using it today. So even though there are all these build it yourself websites and stuff like that, it's still a viable language. And to be honest, the way that a lot of software works is just layer upon layer upon layer upon layer upon layer. And the more layers you know underneath, the more powerful you're going to be. Ruby on Rails is another good example. You can write Ruby on Rails apps without ever knowing SQL, but the people who do know SQL can make it a lot more powerful. So, in an interview, my interviewer told me they developed their product/website in vanilla JavaScript no library, no framework. Is this a good idea or a waste of time? Great question from Sebastian. So the question is that they built their website completely in vanilla JavaScript, no frameworks, no library, no whatever. So is this a good idea? Or is this a waste of time? The answer depends a little bit on what your goal is. If your goal is to build an app and build it fast, my philosophy on frameworks and libraries and all this is this. I will use frameworks and libraries up to the point that I'm battling them. Okay, and what I mean by that is if the framework and the library that I use provides a way for me to do everything that I want to do, I continue to use it. Okay, so jQuery is a good example. So I don't use jQuery for that much anymore, but one of the things I use jQuery for is AJAX calls. Okay, so this is a web framework. It's a web framework that's kind of going out of style right now, but jQuery is a web framework that I use, and that's all I use it for. And granted, it's probably a pretty heavy framework to use just for that, but I still use it. It's kind of nice and friendly for that. And I've never had to do anything to hack it to get it to do what I want to do. It does exactly what I need it to do. I'll give you an example that I do have to hack. A lot of CSS frameworks, like Twitter Bootstrap. Twitter Bootstrap I was using for a while, and I found more and more I had to hack around their CSS. I had to hack around what they were giving me, and I was constantly battling what they were doing. So, I mean, that's probably a fault of me because I didn't learn the framework enough. But I found at that point I'm just battling it. Why don't I just write it from scratch? So when you're coding something, I think it's a good idea to always start with a framework. All right, learn a framework. It gets you over the finish line, and you get users and whatever, and that's great, right? So I think that's really good. I think that's a really good way to create a product and create a product fast. And then at the time when you find it's not really what you need, then you build your own. Shopify did this. Shopify for a long time, I believe, maybe not a long time, but for some time was using jQuery. And then they found it not good enough, so they built their own. So they had a library called Batman.js, and so they built their own. So for a while they were using it. So kind of like, use these frameworks until you feel that they're not good enough, basically. That's if your goal is to build a product. Okay, if your goal is to learn, I would say vanilla stuff is really good. Like I very rarely use CSS frameworks. I borrow ideas from CSS frameworks, but I code all my CSS myself. And it's made me a really good CSS programmer because of that, right? So if you want to learn and become an expert in something, then coding something in vanilla something is really good. By the way, I did get the question at one point, somebody asking me what vanilla meant. Vanilla, it's the thing about vanilla ice cream, like plain old ice cream. It basically means the plain old language without any frameworks or libraries built on top of it. So yeah, I would say it's fine, like to go vanilla if you're trying to learn. If you're not trying to learn, but you're just really trying to get a product out there and trying to improve and get that product out there, I would say use a framework until it becomes frustrating to use, basically. I've taken SEG 2900 class where we had to create a website for a product last semester. I learned HTML and Vanilla.js, but is there any languages, frameworks you would recommend we should learn if we want to create our own website? Yeah, so the question is, so this Tasty Pastry, I probably know you, but again, not by Tasty Pastry name. They learn HTML and CSS, and they're wondering what other frameworks to learn for if they want to build their own website. So if you want to build your own website, again, ask yourself what the goal is. If the goal is just to get a website up so you can advertise yourself, whatever, I would actually recommend using one of these build your own things like Wix or whatever, or like WordPress. But if you want to learn to become a web developer, okay, I always say pick something that's low barrier to entry. Mo was on the chat right here. I asked him this. I told him the same thing. So Mo is a first-year software engineer who knows Java. He's taking a class in Java either right now or did last semester. And he wanted to learn some web development. And most languages that you learn in university, whether it be, again, Python, Java, C#, whatever, most of them have an associated web framework. Okay, so Java has JSP, C# has .NET, Ruby has Ruby on Rails, these kind of things, right? So I would recommend picking a framework that uses a language that you know. Okay. So if you happen to know Java, I would start with maybe JSP. If you happen to know Ruby, I would start with Ruby on Rails or something like that. Because again, web has its own set of challenges to learn and stuff like that, and it's kind of really frustrating if you have to learn the two, right? So I'll give you an example that I've told people in the past where I was trying to learn an IoT project. I was programming this like little microcontroller, and there's all this complication I had to learn about IoT and how IoT communicates with everything. And I was even using AWS, like Amazon's built-in IoT infrastructure. But the native language that I had to use for the microcontroller was C. And I hadn't programmed C since first year university. So while trying to figure out all this complicated stuff of the IoT, I also had to figure out how to concatenate a string in C, which was like really hard, by the way. So I would recommend you pick a framework that uses a language that you know. If you don't really care about any of that stuff, I am very partial to Ruby on Rails, because Ruby on Rails is a great framework that can grow with you. I learned it in 2011, and it's what kickstarted my passion for software engineering. There's a lot of great tutorials, a lot of great documentation, some really, really good stuff there. The other one is Express. Express uses Node. So Node.js it's interesting. It's a way to run JavaScript on your machine. Usually JavaScript's run in the browser. JavaScript can run on your machine using Node.js. And Node.js has a web framework called Express. I think they have a bunch of others as well, but Express is the one that I keep hearing a lot of. So Express is a great one. And I know what's really nice about Express is I think it's like really quick to get like a web page up and running. So Node and Express would be another great one if you don't have any other knowledge of other languages. But if you happen to know Visual Basic or C# or Ruby or Java or whatever, pick something that is associated with that language. I think that would be a great way to start. Can you talk about imposter syndrome in SWE? How can one overcome that? Mo, can you clarify SWE? I'll answer that question if I know what SWE is. I'll move on to the next one. Zach, personally, I highly recommend React. I want to give a little shout out to Zach. Zach's another first year student who's just blown my mind in terms of how fast his learning has gone. He came into first year, didn't know much web programming, and now he's already launched his first e-commerce store, which is great. So, and he learned it, he built it in React, so really cool stuff. So yeah, Mo, just let me know what SWE is and I'll try to answer that. Speaking of saturation, where do you see the future of the job of software engineer? Do you think it's becoming saturated a lot? Oh, software engineer. Okay, I'll go back to that question. Yeah, I don't know. I'm very Ottawa influenced, so I always think software engineering is SEG. So software engineering, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, cool. Can I talk a little bit about the imposter syndrome in SWE? How can one overcome that? Don't have great advice on this, but okay, let me tell you something that I learned very young as a kid. I learned this from my parents a lot, but usually, and this is not always the case, but usually when people tout their accomplishments or what they know or what, I don't know, just stuff that can make you feel inadequate, right? Like somebody looks at your code and they're like, oh man, how come you didn't prevent for SQL injection or how did this and that or whatever, right? First of all, the majority of the time, and I'm not saying I'm perfect at this, I do this all the time too. We're all guilty of this, but usually, I'm not saying all the time, this is coming from a place of insecurity. Okay, people feel the need to show off their knowledge. Okay, and I will say in my experience, at times when I felt inadequate in software engineering because of people saying this, most of the time on the other side, it's really just that. They just would love to share their knowledge. It's not that they're trying to put you down. It's that they're proud that they know something and they want to share that with you. Okay. Not even necessarily just share that with you. They just want to share the fact that they know that with you. Okay. And that's fine. Like, give them a pat on the back, like, thank you for letting me know that. Right. And I feel like a lot of imposter syndrome in software engineering comes from that. It comes from other people talking about technologies and concepts and all this stuff that you don't know, right? Because you're, oh, frig, I don't know this, I don't know this, whatever, right? So first of all, take that with a grain of salt. Take it that one, it either is coming from a place of insecurity, or two, they just want to share the fact that they know this, or both. Okay? So don't take it so harsh. That's one piece of advice I can give. The second piece of advice I can give is understand that software is a massive, massive field. Okay? It is huge. There is so much stuff to learn. Okay? And it's crazy, all the concepts and all the languages and all the frameworks and all. So the reality is, whoever you're talking to that's making you feel like an imposter, they don't know everything. They might know the one thing you're talking about at this point, and yes, they may be better than you at it, but they don't know everything, right? And there's chances are the things that there's the stuff that that they don't know, right? And it just happens to be the environment that you're in, whether it's the class that you're in, the job that you're in, whatever you're in, it just happens to be that, right? Take faith in that if you work hard and you study and you take your time and learn it the way that you learn best, that you will get there, right? Again, for 11 years or 10 years, I felt not great at software engineering. And it was just a little flip of learning something that I felt really good at. And that was it. And I started ignoring, when other people would say, and in fact, I would start to embrace the stuff that I didn't know, because I hated people. I didn't hate people, but I hated when people would profess to be know-it-alls and put other people down, right? I loved saying the phrase, oh, I really don't know about that, I always like saying the phrase, like, our friend Justin, he probably gets kicked out of this every time I say this, but I love saying that I hated Objective-C, and Objective-C, like, basically kicked my ass. Like, I was really bad at Objective-C, right? And I found I got a lot of positive feedback on when you start to embrace what you don't know, right? Because if you think about it, let's rewind a little bit. If the reason that they're saying that is because they want to share that knowledge with you, the instant you say, I really don't understand that, or I really don't know that, they will probably welcome that and teach it to you, right? And so if you ever feel inadequate because of other people and what they're saying, I would think about it a little bit that way, and you will get there. You will definitely get there. And the important thing is you're making progress. That's the most important thing, in my opinion, in everything. It's like, as long as you've seen any little bit of progress, keep doing it, and you'll do really well. If you're feeling imposter syndrome for other reasons, let me know, and I can try to answer that. So, speaking of saturation, where do you see the future of the job of software engineer? Do you think it's becoming saturated? A lot of people are switching to this field. I really don't have a gauge of how saturated it is. I do think it is like the new thing. Or not the new thing. I mean, it's been the new thing for years, but I do think it is a very important thing in our world right now. Maybe I'll give a real world example. So last couple weeks, ByteSight has been hit a little bit by the whole COVID-19 thing. We've definitely had clients who have kind of winded down their projects a little bit. We've definitely had that, but we've had a couple clients who are still considered essential services, and they're still needing us there. And if anything, they've needed us more, right? Because a lot of craziness is happening on their web application or whatever, right? I think the thing is, we're not at a point where every single industry or every single vertical or every single business is using software to its full potential. I think that's why businesses like ByteSight can survive, because businesses like ByteSight, like you think about any business that you come across or any person you come across, I bet you in some way their life could probably be made a little bit more efficient with software, or improved in some way with software. And so I don't think we're quite at that point of saturation. I think there are certain parts and certain cities and certain companies that are getting saturated, but I think the opportunity to develop software is still very much open. So I think what we consider software engineers today is still very much a thing, going to be a thing for a while, especially with new technologies, again, like AI, machine learning, AR, these kind of things, right? I think the nice thing is the big boys like Apple, Facebook, they're kind of paving the way for the little guys like me to kind of like do some really cool things, right? Because we're kind of a little bit like in the middle, right? We're not quite like Byteside, and what I do is like kind of like not as advanced as the people like Facebook, but we're not as not as un technologically evolved as kind of like your mom and pop shop who's selling shoes and using paper and pen to do the receipts or whatever, right? Things like that. So we're kind of in between that. So finally, what's your honest opinion of academics and grades in software engineering? Okay, my opinion of academics and grades in software engineering. I think I came from a very academic background. I took school. School was definitely my number one priority from kindergarten until I graduated. I was definitely like, it was where I kind of shined. And I kind of answered this question before, but from an employer's perspective, I would say all other things being equal, grades do matter. Like if I have two candidates and they're basically the same on paper, and I see one person's GPA is higher than the other, it's unfortunate I'm going to go with the higher GPA, even though they might not be the better software engineer. To be honest, I'd probably interview them both to figure it out. I will say good grades do indicate something that they indicate something more than just the grade itself. I don't think grades make you a good software engineer. I don't think grades, like I had a lot of friends who had terrible grades and were way better software engineers than I. So I don't think they say how good a software engineer you'll be. But I do think grades tell a different side of you. They show that you know how to work hard, because I don't think you can get, like, in my opinion, you cannot get good grades in university, undergrad, without working hard to some extent. You just can't. Like you have to work hard to some extent. It shows that you can probably time manage. It shows that you can get through a really hard 4 years, or whatever program you're doing, like a really tough couple of years. It shows how you work, you know how to work in big systems. It shows you know how to take exams, which shows that you can work under pressure. It says a lot of different things, okay? It doesn't mean if you have bad grades, we're not going to hire you. It doesn't mean if you have bad grades, you're going to be a bad software engineer. But if you have good grades, it does say a lot about you that I think that it's very important to the job. It's not yes, we're going to hire you, but it does say a lot that's very important in the job. So but the other thing I was going to say on this topic, which I've said before, is you have to do a cost benefit analysis in terms of academics versus non-academics. If you are going to put in 50 more hours into your grades, and that's going to get you 1 extra percent, versus if you put in 50 extra hours into a personal project and that gets you a lot of attention, then you should probably put those hours into the personal project, because the benefit is 1%. Other way around. If you put in 50 more hours into your personal project and it doesn't go anywhere and nobody ever looks at it or never sees the light of day and you don't learn anything, and if you put 50 hours into your academics and it raises your grades by 20%, well, I would say maybe put your effort into the grades, because again, bang for your buck. So okay. All right. Just a couple more questions here. We're coming up to 9:30, and maybe I'll start to wrap it up around 9:30. Maybe we'll keep this kind of to an hour and a half. A couple things while people are still here before I answer the last couple questions. I do want to do this regularly. I had a lot of fun tonight. And if you guys want to learn more stuff and ask more questions, I'd love for you guys to join me. You see my Twitter handle right there at CaseyLee23. Definitely tweet at me any feedback that you want. I think weekly, maybe every Thursday at 8 p.m. would be a good time to do it, but I'm happy to listen to the crowd. If you want to get notified, though, hit the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. If you're new to YouTube, literally hit subscribe, and there will be a little bell beside it. Hit the bell icon, and then you'll actually be notified when I'm going to do a live stream. So definitely don't forget to do that. And you're supporting me, and I had a lot of fun, and I really want to continue this. So, and I'd love to shape it with you guys. Okay. So last couple questions here. Hi, Casey. Any advice for? So this is Jack. This is one of my employees, and we have a great relationship. Any advice for startups or freelancers who are struggling right now because of the situation of COVID, both financially and mentally? Ooh, that's a tough question. Any advice? Okay, so I I don't want to make light of the situation. There is obviously a lot of stuff going on. But I want you guys to know that I'm actually in a pretty good state. I'm not just saying that so you guys know I'm okay. I'm saying this because I want to let you guys know what I've been doing to kind of keep busy in this time. So, um, if you guys are software developers, um, you know, I mean, we kind of have the fortune that we have existing customers. And I will say getting new customers is going to be probably very rough. Nobody wants to spend money right now. Nobody wants to start anything new right now. Nobody wants to meet right now. Like there's a lot that's tough here. But take comfort in the fact that you are in a field that you can totally work from home and do all this remotely, right? So, like any other sales, like kind of trying to talk to people, advertising, whatever, that's the way to do it. Um, this I haven't really been doing that because again we've been fortunate with our existing customers. But what I have been doing is stuff like this. Okay, so this is a little bit for my own personal satisfaction and talk about mentally. Um, I really want to share with you guys something that has really stuck with me over the last couple months. When you start a business and when you get into the software engineering world, sometimes it's very easy to get very lost in your work, and sometimes it's very easy to define yourself by your work. If you're not a good software engineer, you have nothing else, or if your business is not doing well, you have nothing else. And one thing that I'm really getting back to in the last couple months is realizing that that's not true. Last weekend I put on like a concert, music, like playing guitar. I'm really getting back into my music. Live streaming is apparently my new hobby right now. Setting up this microphone and OBS and all this stuff and doing all this stuff. It's very satisfying. So, finding hobbies and kind of getting back to them can really help with your mental. And if you're talking financially, I don't have a lot of advice there, unfortunately. But I would say, if you can find hobbies that might potentially help you professionally. So whether that be the time right now to build an app, right? Build a new website, take this time to do that kind of stuff, right? Me and my friend, we just built Local Eats Ottawa, right? This was literally like last Wednesday we met and we're like, we should build this. And we built it and we helped out people, right? And I'll be honest, like for me, it wasn't about the altruism of helping the world. I just wanted a software project to work on, right? So if you guys can find projects, I mean, you guys are on this chat right now, right? I will leave this live stream open for 5-10 minutes after I kind of get off the air, but you guys should connect and start making projects and stuff like that, right? It may not pay right now, but it may pay in the future. Unfortunately, when it comes to the actual financial situation, if you're really struggling there, that's tough. I don't have any great advice there. I don't think. Like the best thing I can do is like, do know that people do want websites and web apps in this time. People are looking for things like like announcements and stuff like that. And maybe you start off by building something for free for somebody and then say, hey, like, would you mind like giving me a little cash or something like that, right? Like, because there's a lot of businesses out there that are struggling themselves, right? So maybe you can help them out or something like that, right? Or whatever. Unfortunately, it is a time where we're trying to help each other out a lot, right? It's kind of like, it's tough, right? It's definitely tough. So I'm going to stop talking on that because I'm going to ramble, and I feel like I don't have great advice on the financial side. But on the mental side, getting back into your hobbies and trying new things. If you guys don't have an idea, try a live stream. Who knows? Okay, and then this will be the last question of the night, guys. So I'm trying to deploy my first full stack application soon. React, Node.js, and PostgreSQL. I'm having trouble deciding which cloud platform I should deploy it from. Any recommendations? Okay, recommendations for deployment. Again, I don't have the greatest, widest experience in this. So I use Heroku, and if you just want to test it out, Heroku is free for a certain number of hours. So Heroku. So let me just show you guys here. Whoops. Heroku.com. So the way that Heroku works is it's free to start off, and they give you a bank of hours, basically. So your website wouldn't be up and running 24/7. The way it works is it spins up a server, and if that server doesn't get access for like 30 minutes or something, it spins it down. So the next person to visit it, it might take a little while for your page to load, but then after that, it'll stay alive for a little while and spin down. And as long as your app isn't running for more than the bank of hours they give you, which is a decent amount, it's not 24/7, but it's a decent amount, you don't have to pay anything. So I would recommend starting with Heroku because it's free to try out, right? And the nice thing about Heroku is they have a lot of built-in systems, right? So if you like, you can look right here, right? They have Node, Ruby, Java, all this stuff like that. So they kind of have built-in, they call them build packs, that if you're deploying a Node app, they will know what to do with it and fire it up and all that stuff like that, right? So as long as you understand Git, you do need to know Git. As long as you don't understand Git, I think Heroku would be a good place to go. Other than that, the only other hosting services I've used Firebase, but Firebase is, as far as I know, strictly front-end stuff, so HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. If you have a Node backend, I don't think you can use Firebase for deployment. And then other than that, there are these like kind of set up yourself servers. So Amazon, AWS, they have something called EC2. A lot of letters there. So Amazon AWS was Amazon Web Services, which is a collection of like 50 billion services. And one of those services is called EC2, which is a virtual server that you can log in and set up yourself. So EC2 would be another thing. And for a long time, people were using DigitalOcean. I don't know if that's still popular or not, but DigitalOcean was a thing. So I would say if you're just kind of looking for quickest way to get in there, I would say start with Heroku and then go from there. So. Okay, so guys, this has been a lot of fun. I had a great time. I really want to thank everybody for joining. You guys obviously make this worth it. Who knows? Maybe I would have done this completely by myself and nobody was listening. But hopefully we can grow this audience a little bit and have some great chats and have some great time. Doing things like this. Obviously, people are self-isolating and quarantining. So really appreciate this, guys. Again, if you want to get notified, subscribe to my channel and then hit the bell icon to get notified. Otherwise, follow me on Twitter at CaseyLead23. And I do want to hear your feedback if you guys want this to be weekly and if you want it at the same time or if you want to change it to a different time or whatever. Definitely. Why don't we say, unless you guys hear otherwise, we're going to do this weekly at 8 p.m. and then we'll do it for about an hour and a half every night. And go from there. So really thanks everybody. I'll leave the chat open for a little while afterwards, just so if you guys want to connect or whatever. I'll stay on the chat too if there's any questions or whatever. If you guys want it more lecture based or you want it more Q&A based, let me know. We can switch it up from week to week. If there are specific topics that you want me to cover, definitely send them my way. You can direct message me, CaseyLead23, or whatever way you guys can get in touch with me. So weekly podcast would be a good idea. Yeah. I mean, I could figure that out too. bit more effort. But anyways, thanks everybody. You guys have made this awesome. Thanks for spreading the word. If you guys can do me a favor and help spread the word about this to everybody else too, I'd love this to grow. And also, this will be when this is done on YouTube, it will be like saved and recorded. So if you ever want to come back and watch this stuff or you want to let other people know, that would be great. So thanks so much, guys. Hope everybody stays safe. Hope everybody's keeping cool. And majority students, good luck on your guys' exams. I will understand if you can't join the Thursday night chat because you're studying for exams. So thanks, everybody. This has been really cool. I really love it. Thanks.